In today's ever-evolving work environment, leadership roles have expanded beyond traditional functions, making holding employees accountable increasingly challenging. Leaders are no longer just decision makers or visionaries. They must also be educators, mediators, and coaches. And while there are so many articles written about accountability, few touch on the most important competency a leader must have: emotional intelligence. Could this be? Stay tuned as we offer insight into why a lack of emotional intelligence is the missing link in addressing performance lapses effectively.
Welcome to Dismantling Dysfunction, a podcast series for anyone who is ready to eliminate the dysfunction they experience in their organizations, leaders, or relationships. Each week, we explore common dysfunctions in organizations, delving into the systemic causes behind them, and giving you the exact tools and practical tips you need to dismantle them. Now, here are your hosts, organizational development and behavioral change experts, Dr. Anne Dranitsaris and Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today as we continue our series on accountability and how the dysfunction of accountability, or a lack of accountability, in organizations has become an epidemic. In our first podcast on this topic, we talked about a number of different ways that leaders contribute, including, or in particular, the mindset where they say, oh, it's not my job, or I can't say these things to people, or they shouldn't have to remind their direct report. Sound familiar? Probably heard some of those yourself, right? And probably the biggest one, just a lack of leadership training. And it's so surprising how many leaders really hesitate to embrace accountability as part of their job. And not because they don't have systems in place or performance management. It's really because they lack that self-awareness it takes to know how it is that their fears are actually getting in the way of doing their job. So it's why we decided to make the connection in today's episode for our audience about the interplay between emotional intelligence and performance accountability. But before we continue, make sure you hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest leadership videos. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you're checking us out on YouTube. If you find it valuable, if you're hearing it on the podcast again, we love to hear from you and appreciate the ratings that you give us so that others can find this content just like you did. So that being said, let's explore a lack of accountability in organizations.
Hey, everybody, and thank you so much for kicking us off on this very important and really interesting topic on a lack of accountability. I'm really reminded of early days over 25 years ago when you and I were launching leadership training sessions on performance management, Heather. Back then, introducing the concept that emotions drive behavior was quite groundbreaking, wasn't it? As in emotional intelligence for leaders at that time, it wasn't mainstream, but we really did. We knew that leaders needed to understand the emotional drivers of their actions or inactions, and that it was pivotal for the success of performance and accountability systems. Think about it. You think about emotions and they're happening all the time in our brain, and they're automatic. They're these biochemical events that are going on in response to what's going on, but they're like little pockets of fuel, or think of them as silent puppeteers behind the scenes, making us dance to their own whims, even when we don't even realize it. And many leaders that we work with, because they don't know what they're feeling at any given time, they don't spend time paying any attention to it, they are at the mercy of their feelings. And for instance, as leaders, there are many moments when we know what needs to be done, or we know we should be saying something, but fear holds us back. And we don't say, I'm afraid, or I fear confrontation, or I fear rejection, or maybe I'm wrong. And this is the issue. Rarely do leaders admit to themselves, and I really have to reinforce that. It's the not admitting that this fear is holding me back that becomes problematic. It makes us feel too vulnerable, doesn't it? Instead, they mask it. They cloak their fears with seemingly valid excuses like the classic, I'm just too busy to take care of this or to do this right now. But in those moments, if we paused and dug deep, we'd often find it isn't genuine busyness keeping us from acting, but rather some anxiety or fear that's causing us to put the brakes on.
Yeah, and I know for sure, and we talk about that saying, "Oh, I'm too busy." Totally been guilty of that. I know we both have, right? And we see this with our clients, right? It's like, yeah, I'm going to do it. I plan to do it, even, right? And knowing full well, and that notion that it's going to take so much time and it's going to be so long and so much effort is part of the challenge, right? And so we convince ourselves, but really behind it is, I'm just avoiding it because I don't want to do it because I'm too scared, right? But saying, oh, I'm too busy and I didn't take care of it because I was too busy is such an easy out, right? It lets us off the hook. But deep down, again, if we know it, if we're really honest with ourselves, if we really tap in and reflect on our emotions and build that awareness around what it was we're feeling, it allows us to actually be much more impactful as leaders. And leadership goes beyond just making decisions. It's really truly about getting people, and that's ourselves as part of that, right? We really have to understand ourselves. And I still get those jitters thinking about how bold it felt bringing up the whole notion of emotions and behavior connection back in the day. Remember when Anne made a comment about, well, we need to be talking about emotions. I'm like, what? We do? No, we don't, right? It's that freezed moment in my head saying, I can't even imagine going in and having those kinds of conversations with clients. But, it's suggesting, and being able to say to people, performance management in an organization is going to fail because the leaders are too nervous or too unsure. And I still remember doing, and it was more recent, it was in the last kind of 5 or 6 years, where we were doing some performance management training for our clients and working with the leaders. And I was talking about emotions and the emotions of leaders and employees in the process. And one of the leaders then stood up and said, this is a business. There's no place for emotions. And we have people, which means we have emotions. Like, that is just a fact that we need to come to accept, right? And so trying to think that we don't have to navigate that through, the sort of the human experience of it, that of our employees and ourselves, is a real sort of barrier to being effective as a leader from when we're thinking about it from a performance accountability perspective. So it's like, it's so clear now, right? A leader who's in touch with their emotions, who is truly emotionally intelligent, is just in a different league, right? Research bears that out. We've all come to accept that. They're the ones who can hold employees accountable. They're the ones that also will slow down and recognize what their employees need and meet that need in order to get better outcomes and better engagement from their people. And they don't take employees' defensiveness or their behavior personally, right? They hold themselves and they have those required accountability skills, right? They understand that there are different approaches that they use in the accountability process, defining, directing, correcting, confronting, and engaging. And they know how to blend the right amount of assertiveness with empathy. And that lets them really hold their focus on performance and not emotion.
It's so wonderful, isn't it, that we can talk about emotions and not get that immediate response from leaders that we used to get, where it would be like a wall coming down, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But something else we've noticed that I think our audience will find as interesting as we do is how many leaders are in denial about their emotional intelligence. In fact, we know so many leaders who are proud of their emotional intelligence, believing that they've mastered it. They think, oh, I'm not holding someone accountable. That's totally not about my feelings or insecurities. So they're not linking it up. They think they're emotionally intelligent, but holding people accountable isn't really on their radar relative to things that they're afraid of and how they're feeling. But when they constantly avoid taking responsibility or holding others accountable, it's almost like they're waving a big red flag that says, hey, I've got an emotional intelligence gap here, because some emotion is driving that behavior. It's stopping the leader in their track. And what really gets me is some don't even recognize the fear driving them. And I can't say that enough. The fear that keeps tasks ambiguous because they're afraid to spell it out for their employees. It makes them hesitate to put down concrete deadlines. And we know this, Heather. Some of our clients, for example, will say, when do you think you can have this done by, as opposed to, I need this by the end of the day. And so it's like they're dancing around the real issues, perhaps because they're scared of confronting them, or they're mistakenly assuming that everyone's on the same undefined page, or that everyone's joined at the brain, as we like to say, and that if I say it, if I ask an employee to do it, they're going to drop everything and do it for me. And that's not the case. To them, it's a one-dimensional objective issue rather than an emotionally driven leadership issue. And we'll be talking about this more throughout the series, about the mindset of accountability just being a static thing, like it's a place or destination we've arrived at. I'm accountable. And so I don't have to work or consider it any more than that. And not seeing really how nuanced this is.
Yeah, I know we were talking earlier today about this whole, people represented as, well, if you want others to be accountable, just model accountability yourself. And it's like, well, what is that, right? Because it's accountability isn't just, like you say, this static thing or this statement that you make is, of course I'm accountable, and of course people are accountable. It's a process. It's activity. It's action that we take as leaders, and that create the circumstances that lead to a higher level of accountability in our organizations and from our people. And I think I just want to go back to what you were saying about from a fear perspective, and the fact that so many leaders don't recognize it. And for some in our audience who've been following all of our podcasts along, they've probably heard this story before, but I love this one. We have a client in their executive team, and we have conversations like this. Well, why don't you get your EAs to do this for you? Oh no, we can't possibly tell them to do that. Oh no, we can't possibly ask them to do that. And I'm like, well, why not, right? That's part of accountability. You're the leader, you define and you direct people to do what it is that you need them to do, to get them to do the right things at the right time in the right way, right? And oh, we can't possibly do that. And it's like, but they would never see themselves as being afraid of their EAs. They would never acknowledge that, but that's what it is. They are afraid to define and direct for their EAs what they actually want them to do, because they don't want to deal with any kind of emotional reaction that may or may not happen, right? And at the same time, same executive team, well, we can't possibly tell these executives on the team what their roles are and what's expected of them, because they'll be insulted. Again, it's not about how the other people may or may not respond. It's like, I'm too afraid to say that, because I'm afraid I don't know what to ask of them. I'm afraid I don't know how to tell them. I'm afraid I'm being unrealistic. And so they hold these things that create these massive gaps, right, in the organization. So it's just, this is so powerful, right?
Truly, truly powerful. And it also puts me in mind of the drama triangle, where you say to a leader, well, did you ask them why they didn't get this work done when you had agreed it would be done? And they can even say something to the effect of, am I allowed to ask that? And you see these really, VPs, CEOs, not really getting that they have the power to hold people accountable, and they're really abdicating their role authority, their personal authority, when they remain unclear of what they can and can't do, and then ask if they're allowed to. It's like, who's going to tell them if they don't decide that they can do it? There's nobody up there who's going to come down with this big booming voice and say, yes, you're allowed to do that.
When we bring it back to the sort of our conversation here today, of course, is all of that, at the root of that is low emotional intelligence, right? And so while we're sharing these stories to illustrate, it's without judgment of these clients. Like, this is their developmental journey. This is what they are, and that's why they work with us, right? Because they are working on their development, and we're sort of evolving them and developing them up and supporting them from that perspective, right? But it's like, when you think about accountability, again, we throw this word out all the time, like it's this straightforward, objective, simple thing, but it is so laden with personal feelings, personal doubts, imposter syndrome creeps in, lack of skill development, lack of entitlement, like all of these things get pulled into it. The stories we tell ourselves about what we can and can't do, or what we should and shouldn't do. And honestly, there's just so much avoidance that goes into with things when we're looking at it from a leadership perspective and accountability, and the ripple effects. Then, if you live in an organization where there's a lack of accountability, or they're struggling with this dysfunction of a lack of accountability, the ripple effects in the organization are massive, right? Teams pick up on that energy. They sense when things are skewed or unclear, just plain unfair. There's more complaining. People are doing whatever they feel like doing. The organization is missing some of its deadlines and practices. And when morale dips, as it typically does, the entire organization's productivity and the cohesion, like we see way more silos in these types of environments, a lot more blaming and finger pointing. And it's really crucial that leaders dive into these emotions despite the discomfort, right? Face them, and to learn to separate those personal feelings from professional actions. It's, I feel that way, but what do I need to do as the leader in this situation? And by doing that, they can turn accountability from this looming, sort of scary, I just want to bury my head in the sand sort of notion, into an actual opportunity, like catalyst that really propels the entire team to greater heights.
I love the way you talked about that, Heather. You really nailed actually what it is, where you can, it's palpable, the feelings, and really talking about accountability as a complex process, a complex, both an adjective and an adverb and a verb and a noun, and it encompasses everything. But first and foremost, leaders have to experience themselves, and of course that's the emotional intelligence piece of it. They have to experience themselves as leading, and what is it that I need to do to lead my people to the objectives, and how do I hold them accountable for that? They have to be in that leadership experience. And when leaders allow emotions to muddle their approach, of course, then it becomes all subjective. And I know a client I was just with a few days ago, sitting down and just having the whole discussion mired in feelings and doubts, and talking about who likes who, and dodging the real issue. And the real issue, when it came out, was there was no role definition, there were no expectations set. And so the leadership in the organization had become incredibly permissive. And allowing subjectivity and emotions to drive performance systems, it not only lets underperformance slide, or let me say that again, it not only lets performance slide, but it also dampens the team morale, as you alluded to, Heather. Everyone starts feeling disconnected. Everyone's going in a different direction. There's no clarity. There's no a way of getting into alignment. And of course, the more insecure people feel because the structure isn't there, the more they start acting out emotionally. And so this makes accountability not something to dread, but a powerful tool that drives growth in the organization. But leaders can be so busy avoiding performance discussions, or even sitting down to define expectations, because they're just not aware of what's getting in their way. They keep doing what they like to do. I mean, I'm guilty of that. I would rather do the work I love to do than sit down and have a difficult conversation. That can be in my professional life and in my personal life, because we're not in control of those outcomes. We're in control of our work product, but when we're talking to another person about their performance, or even giving them feedback, having an intimate and challenging conversation with someone, it brings up all kinds of emotions in leaders.
Yeah, that's just so spot on. And as you were talking about that, I was also thinking about, We talk about accountability as it relates to like performance accountability, but in an organization where they really are effective in their accountability practices, it also plays out in the kinds of dialogues they have as a team and the level of in the nature of the discussion. I'm thinking about a client of ours where the VP was all set up to go in and to have a conversation with the senior leadership team about something that from an organizational perspective they really needed to be doing. And the leaders got really frightened in that process and started saying, oh, we don't need that. We don't have to do it like that. But ultimately what they were doing is saying, we don't want anything put in place that's going to hold us accountable. And it was all about their opinions. It wasn't based on fact, but it was all based on their fear. And so when we look at accountability from that perspective, it's, there is that aspect where we back off inside of organizations when we don't get the response from people that we want, right? Where people don't immediately say, oh, yes, that's a brilliant idea. Let's do that. Which of course is, again, because we're fear-driven human beings, we don't always get that response when we're bringing forward change in an organization. But so when you think about accountability, and the dysfunction of a lack of accountability, it's not just on the individual level. It really plays out in a number of different ways and places in the organization. And the whole idea with accountability is leaders have to stay focused on the expectation. So that's the defining and directing. What are we trying to achieve? What are the parameters? And how are we going to get there, right? And not let their emotions hijack them. So sometimes even in an organization that's trying to talk strategy or issue resolution, which is part of an accountable organization, because we don't let issues just sit and fester. We actually deal with them in a timely manner. The emotions hijack them, right? And we can see that in their behavior. I mean, how many of you in our audience have sat in a meeting room or boardroom or whatever and had everybody express their opinions over and over and over again that had nothing to do with trying to move the conversation towards a decision? That's about allowing emotions to hijack them, right? Their opinions are being fueled by that fear. And leaders, before leaders can even think about holding someone accountable, though, they really have to be clear on what are they holding them accountable for. Going back to Anne's example, right, is, there's no expectation, there's no role definition. It's not clear the standards against which someone's performance is being held, or a function. I mean, we work with organizations where there's no standards of performance or expectations for how a function performs. We have one client in particular where one of the functional areas is really critical to the success of the business, but the executive that runs that function, there's no expectations for what that function delivers or how it delivers it. So essentially, he gets to go do whatever he wants to do, and everybody has to, deal and adapt around it because of that lack of clarity. And so it's like building a house. So you think about, your construction of a house. To make sure it's up to code, you got to have a blueprint. You got to start from something that really sets all of it out. That's where you set your expectations and you're checking it in. Principle comes into play, right? I can set the expectation, I can check on it. So focusing really on that first stage that from an accountability perspective that we look at is that need to define, right? In order to really drive performance accountability, we talk about everything from that sort of systems perspective, right? So there's a cycle, there's stages to it, there's specific competencies that leaders, or actions, let's forget about competencies, there's actions that leaders must undertake at these stages in order to get to the accountability outcome that they're looking for. And that's the defining. And it is amazing how many leaders don't define, right? Because that's essentially setting out the blueprint that everybody's going to follow. I say that we have to get leaders to stop putting out the ask and instead define, right? What is it that it looks like? and it's sort of this throwaway, and then people are left trying to interpret. And so am I making a straight house, a flat, a 2-level house, of what, it's like the confusion, right? And they all get caught up in that end game thinking, well, if I just ask for what I want, high level, broad, they can go figure it out and then I'm going to get it. And again, they know it's like they act like they know what they're doing, but nobody really else understands what the rules of play are or what it is that the outcome is that they're supposed to be achieving.
It's so clear when you say it like that, Heather, but true enough, where I don't know how many times in my Leadership 101 training sessions where I've given that example of leaders who will actually expect their employees to go and do a complicated task without telling them exactly what to do. And when I give them the baseball example of taking your kids to play baseball for the first time and giving them a bat, ball, and glove and saying, here you go, and not telling them the rules of the game. It's so important because the fallout from this approach is really, it's not just disheartening, it's very destructive to the productivity and to the morale in the organization. When leaders fail to define the rules of the game, what they really expect, team members just assume their own rules. They're left to guess about what's required. And you know what they say about assumptions, we all do. This often leads to wasted time, resources, and efforts just because everyone's interpreting things differently. And just beyond the logistical mess, as I said, it erodes team morale and it makes the leader look incompetent. Leaders don't look at it from that perspective. They can think, well, I'm just being a very modern leader. I'm giving my employees lots of freedom to do whatever it is. But employees need leaders to engage them with specifics so that they will master the tasks that they set out to do. Employees can actually start feeling undervalued and unclear about their contributions and think, if my role or tasks aren't clearly defined, do they even matter? My boss doesn't even have the time to spend on me. I guess I'm not that important. And yes, employees do think that way. Human beings think that way. So lowered productivity, resentment, all kinds of issues on teams that leaders inadvertently create. And then, of course, step back and look and say, why are my employees behaving this way? What's wrong with them? And, again, this is, we say this jokingly, but this is human nature for us to do this because we have a blind spot around accountability and performance as a cycle, and employees having needs, specific needs for a leader to use certain competencies and take certain actions, as Heather said, at specific places in the performance cycle to hold people accountable.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we use the word accountable, people always think of the back end, right? And what we've spent more time on is talking about the front end and the last little bit of this podcast. And that's really important. It's such a crucial step that gets missed, right? That define and direct, right? And that piece of obviously setting expectations is a key aspect of it. And when we hear in today's environment, everyone's talking about quiet quitting and entitlement. I mean, entitlement's been around forever, but what's a generational issue? They blame it on the fact that it's a generational issue, but it's like we've lost the art of defining and directing. And I do agree with what we've been saying, and what you've talked about is that the fear, right? That how the fear stops leaders from going into that place of defining, right? Because I'm afraid they're going to think I'm micromanaging them. I'm afraid that, but I think it's also, and we always remind people with these, when we talk about this is a skill we can all learn. Like, even if defining and directing doesn't come naturally to you, like I'm one of those people, right? Where it's not part of my leadership style. I give information. So I have to really consciously go, did I provide the definition and the direction that's actually needed for people to follow what it is and produce what it is I need them to produce? And so it's a skill. And so always keep that in mind when we look at these gaps that we're talking about and the dysfunctions in organizations we can develop our way through it, but we have to put the work in, both from an emotional intelligence perspective and from a skill perspective. So with that, I'm going to drop our gem for the day because I know we've given you lots to consider and ponder. And this is always, like, for us, kind of bringing you down to, okay, what's that thing that you can right now take away and start to put into action, right? Being an effective leader with developed emotional intelligence, which of course includes self-awareness and the courage to face one's fears and do it anyway, isn't easy. We know that. We can't flick a switch. It doesn't happen overnight, but it doesn't mean that if you haven't developed your emotional intelligence, that you get to abdicate responsibility for this particular aspect of your role as a leader. I know it's great to be a leader, but there's work to be done and there's action to be taken in order to be effective in your leadership role. So we say, time to wake up, time to really think about your development and not just focus on the easy tasks of the role or your preferred tasks, right? So what we like to do, what we get the most enjoyment from. So taking yourself seriously as a leader, thinking of yourself as a professional in this role of leadership, and actually prioritizing your development, which we know most leaders don't have a plan that they are specifically working against in order to continue to build their leadership effectiveness. Performance accountability is so critical to leaders at all levels, but particularly the higher up you go in the organization, you haven't mastered the EI and the accountability leadership competencies that are essential to be effective, you're always going to be producing these gaps in your organization. So time to let go of the fear of being misunderstood or being criticized or being judged, and really let go of that internal dialogue that's letting you off the hook. I'm too busy. I shouldn't have to tell them, they should just know what I expect of them. And instead, really, again, take that ownership of the fact that you're a professional leader. Your development is is essential for your employees' path to success in their role. So if you're not developing first, then they're not going to be able to develop the way you need them to.
And today we have a little teaser for all of you in our audience who are interested in finding out more. It's just a little tease. But if you're interested in developing your performance accountability competencies and want to elevate leadership in your organization, make sure that you're following us as we roll out our new program,
The Ultimate Accountability Experience.
Because we want to give you and your leadership team the actual experience of holding people accountable through developing a systematic approach and all of the skills that you and your people need to create a culture of accountability. Remember, accountability does not happen in a vacuum, as Heather said. This is a developmental challenge, and leaders have to take this very seriously, because so much is said about this culture of accountability as though, boom, snap your finger and you can just create it by modeling the way. There are different competencies, and we're really excited to be rolling out this program. So watch our upcoming podcasts and make sure that you're on our mailing list to receive our newsletters. So that's a wrap for this episode of Dismantling Dysfunction. As always, we're your hosts, Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard and myself, Dr. Ann Dranitsaris, committed to the many challenges leaders experience, as well as leadership behaviors that contribute to dysfunction in organization. Thanks so much for listening, and join us again for our next episode, where we're going to continue on talking about the epidemic of accountability and exploring another of the competencies for leading with accountability. We hope you'll join us. Tell your friends, bring other people along with you as we help leaders empower themselves to be accountable for the performance of their employees, their functional area, and their organization, with more stories and adventures of our life in the world of dismantling dysfunction.
Yeah, Ann and I love nothing more than being able to help leaders like you who are looking to really up your game to transform the way in which you are leading. And we know that one of the things that we have seen, for years and years and years, and it's part of the reason why we wrote our book, So You Think You Can Lead, going back several years now, is because of this movement away from accountability, leaders really driving accountability to more of a permissive approach. And so I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited about the conversations we're having, because we're breaking it down. We've got a blueprint that allows us to really break down this big word of accountability into really specific actions that leaders take that make it so simple for leaders to move into this, to move through their fears, to move through their emotions. So really, again, hope you've enjoyed our content today. Really appreciate you being in our audience, and that looking forward to hearing about some of your journeys as you work to put some of this learning into practice in your role and in your own organization. Again, just a reminder, if you're finding our content valuable, please hit thumbs up. If you're watching the video, share it with other leaders. Give us a review and rating on your favorite podcast platform. We absolutely appreciate your support. And again, don't forget to follow our LinkedIn pages, turn on notifications that you never miss a live video. And if you have questions, if you have comments, you want more information, please, we really encourage you to reach out to us. And we look forward to having you back in our audience again for our next episode.
And if you missed the live session, you can catch the video on our YouTube channel. So make sure to, anytime you miss one of our sessions, our live sessions, just hop on over to our YouTube channel and you can catch it over there. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notifications again. And until next time, embrace accountability and become the leader you and your team deserves. Remember, true leadership begins with self-accountability. So we'll see you in the next video.
Thank you for listening to the Dismantling Dysfunction podcast with Dr. Ann Dranitsaris and Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard, organizational development and behavioral change experts. Be sure to subscribe to get more practical insights and focused tools to help you dismantle dysfunction in your organizations, leaders, or relationships. For more information, visit dismantlingdysfunction.com.